Brilliant. We can see you as well. Welcome to TEDxYORK. This is, just want to move the pointer away from, there you go. The pointer was on your nose there, Kristin. We've moved, the sun's moving around, and we're now in Adelaide. We're now in Western Australia. What we want to say now is that Kristin is an engineer. She runs Bridge 8, and she's a friend and a colleague of mine. And again, what we want to do is just to really have an opportunity to hear from the other side of the world around the work that she's been doing in terms of putting ideas together that sometimes, on the face of it, don't make any sense whatsoever. So, thank you very much indeed, Kristin Alford.
Thank you, Marcus, and hopefully you can all hear me okay. Look, I'm just delighted to be able to talk to you today at TEDxYORK, especially because it involves science, arts and creativity. The work that we do at Bridge 8 is all about using the nexus of that to build scientific literacy in the community and to explore innovation. For me, the theme about looking at new ways of innovation and creativity that you're exploring today is critical, because I think sometimes we fall into the trap of looking at innovation and saying it's an incremental thing, or we just need to keep doing something slightly differently and it will be fine. It's almost like a magic ingredient that you add to try and solve any intractable problem. And the way that I think about intractable problems is pretty much on this first slide, so hopefully you can see the slides as well. Basically a big lump with a lock in the middle to sort of say, well, how do we actually get around this problem, and how do we think about things? And in terms of innovation, I think one of the things that comes to mind when I'm thinking about better ways to create innovation was a project we did a couple of years ago, where we looked at advanced manufacturing and how to improve advanced manufacturing in my local area in South Australia. At the same time we were doing that, Mitsubishi, the automotive manufacturer, actually closed a factory that meant 2,000 people lost their jobs. So the project that we were doing became quite important in terms of, can we actually design advanced manufacturing to find new ways of employing people and to find new jobs within this sector. But the maths really worried me. So when I looked at trying to replace 2,000 people, and I looked at the advanced manufacturing businesses we were seeing, which were generally small businesses of about 5 to 20 people, and I thought about the fact that you have a fairly high failure rate for R&D commercialisation, and you need to create small business sustainability. I worked out you probably needed about 1,400 scientists and engineers, each to come up with a new idea and to create a business around that. And I thought, where do these people get the chance to have that experience, and where do they develop entrepreneurial spirit and have the chance to play? And so that really got me thinking about how we might provide those sorts of spaces. So what I wanted to talk to you today about was a project we've just set up called the XTK Projects, which essentially is peer-sourced funding for cross-disciplinary ideas that don't make any sense. And I'll go through how we've designed that process and what some of the outcomes are so far, and why we're excited about what the potential is. So I guess the first thing is how do you actually reconceive an intractable problem? And my next slide should show you just a triangle sitting around that lump to sort of say, can we bound this intractable problem in any different way? And this triangle is actually quite a sophisticated model, believe it or not, which comes out of the peace theorist Johann Galtung, who looked at ways of managing violent conflict. And he said, if you come to an intractable problem where there's a violent conflict, how are you going to actually break it down so that it makes a bit more sense? And how are you going to find areas that are currently stuck that you might be able to unstick? And so the points of the triangle are really to say, if you look at the attitudes of people, so that's one end, and their behaviours, and that's another end, and the contradiction or the conflict that they're trying to manage, and that's the other end, and start to ask questions about that, or reverse your thinking about that. Maybe that will unstick something. And the example I just wanted to pull out was one that has recently been done by the Centre for Social Innovation here in Adelaide, where they looked at the intractable problem of families in crisis. So if you have families in crisis who might be looking at drug or alcohol addictions, there might be school truancy, there might be domestic violence, and they're at risk of coming into contact with the Department of Families, what might you do that is different to help those families? So they ran a 12-month process, and the first thing they did was they broke down the attitudes. So instead of coming in with an attitude about what is a family, they actually sat with families for long periods of time and asked them questions like, what is your family? How do you think about your family? What is it the things that your family does? So completely opened up the space for creating attitudes about what a family should be. Another thing they did was they looked at ways to change behaviour. So instead of what might be, I guess, a normal process of trying to encourage people to change the types of behaviour or stopping certain bad behaviours, they actually partnered up families that had a need with other families who'd recently gone through a similar type of crisis. So it was very easy for those new families to see how somebody else had changed their behaviour and how they'd managed to go through it. And the last thing they did, which I think is the real genius part of this project, is they looked at what government services would be provided. And they said, well, what government services might we provide in this space? And then they said, well, what is the thing that's stuck? And if government services is what's stuck in this innovation cycle, what if we didn't provide any government services? And so they've gone back to saying, how does this peer environment where those two families are sharing their experiences, does that actually help? And do we actually need to intervene with a government service? And the answer was no, and they've done something completely different. And I just think that's a really lovely example of how you might be able to break down the aspects of the intractable problem, like in my next slide, where it all shatters apart once you start to find the bits of that problem you can then unstick. So that's the first thing we started to think about in terms of how might we approach innovation differently. The second thing we thought about was the network. And this is my next slide, which should be a series of dots where you're trying to find the right people in the network. And I think it's really important that if you're trying to create something new, you need to pull on the people within your social networks that really can provide you with some different thinking or with some different understanding, or people who are actually motivated to make a difference to what it is that you're doing. The example I wanted to pull is we've just recently done an Australian pilot of a project that's been running in the UK for 3 years called I'm a Scientist, Get Me Out of Here. So I don't know if any of you are familiar with it. Essentially, it's 2 weeks of online engagement where scientists speak to school students online. Students ask them questions. At the end of the 2 weeks, the scientists get evicted one by one until there's one left, just like reality TV. And we watched this unfold in Australia last year and just loved it. And of course, we needed to find the people in our network that could introduce us to the people who ran it. We needed to find funders here in Australia that could help us do that. But more importantly, we needed to find the right schools and the right scientists to really make the most of that pilot. And we did that by approaching schools who'd worked with us before, so they had an appreciation of the sort of work that we did. And we also did it by finding scientists who were specifically interested in advocacy of science or public engagement with science. And we didn't know all of the scientists who ended up doing that program, but through our networks, we were able to draw on the right people and get the right people excited about participating. So a very deliberate attempt to find the right people rather than just, sending something out to all corners. So that's the second thing that was really important in thinking about how you might do more innovative thinking. The third thing is about spaces. So this is my next slide, which should hopefully sort of show some buildings or some clouds around that network. Finding the right spaces for people to collaborate is really, really critical. And often when we think about collaboration, online collaboration comes to mind. Can you pull your network in through Twitter or through Facebook or through other social media channels? But for us, doing it offline in a physical space is just as important. And finding the right space to create an environment where people can come together and do exciting things is really important. And one of the projects I wanted to mention here was a project that came out of a couple of years ago called the Format Festival here in Adelaide. And what they did was they created a space, a tent, for people to come and gather and do interesting things. And those interesting things were completely random. They ranged from people doing dance collectives, flash mob stuff down the mall, to bake-offs, to galleries, to a whole range of things. But what they found was that by providing that space for people to come in and do interesting things, a whole lot of really nice collaborations developed. And those people went on to do other interesting things with each other in a way that actually created some value to the life of the city, some real grassroots arts coming through into the city. Those same people are involved in a project called Renew Adelaide, which is basically taking old buildings throughout the city and looking at how those spaces, while they're waiting for development to happen, might be lent or leased on short-term non-commercial rate basis to people with good ideas. So that provided spaces for bookshops, for fashion designers, and a lovely space in town called Tuxedo Cat, which is in an old Telegraph building and is a temporary pop-up cabaret venue. Wonderful spaces for people to come together and just do interesting things and really create some light around the centre of the city. And I think that's really important for innovation. Often we think of innovation as new and shiny, but there were two things in Stephen Johnson's Where Good Ideas Come From that really struck me. And one of those was that new ideas happen in old buildings. So I just love the work that Richard Adelaide's doing, because I think that allows that to happen. The other piece of idea is how innovation occurs. And he said, often you think that innovation would be a process of a spark, a eureka moment, a sudden flash of inspiration. And he said, innovation rarely occurs that way. It usually occurs because somebody has had a slow hunch that builds up over time. And what happens is that one person with a slow hunch runs into another person with a slow hunch, and from that, those two hunches come together to create something new. And this is the point of my next slide, which shows two things that are quite different coming together to create something new. And I think that's where we really get to the essence of innovation. One group that I really admire that does this well is the Institute of Photonics and Sensing, which is based at the University of Adelaide. So there's two examples I'd like to pull out about what they do. Essentially, they're a research group that looks at providing sensors for the defence industry, for the agriculture industry, using very long, thin threads of glass and laser technology. One of the things they've done is do a joint exhibition with a local glass arts-based factory called Jam Factory here, and they've done a joint art science exhibition exploring the nature of glass art, which was just lovely. The other thing that they've done, which I think illustrates the bringing together of two ideas, is part of what they developed in their sensing was when they were developing it, they realised that there was this opportunity where you could actually measure temperature at a very fine area using the sensor. So you could actually measure the temperature of a spot on, a tiny little spot if you wanted to. And they said, well, that's, interesting, but useless. We really need to know the temperature of a spot. Until they spoke with the director of the Institute for Obstetrics, and he said, well, we do actually need to know and be able to control the temperature of a very fine area when we're looking at embryo development for IVF. And if we can monitor and control temperature at that very, very fine area, that means the embryo viability is much higher and we have much higher success rates for IVF. And now they've got a joint research project looking at that intersection between lasers and pregnancy, which to me makes absolutely no sense, but the putting of it together is just quite beautiful. So how ideas come together is also quite critical, and bringing two disparate ideas together is important. The final thing that we've looked at when designing this XTK projects to look at different ways of doing innovation is to look at my next slide, which shows a graduation from quite a nonsense space where nothing really exists, through to chaos, then to order, and then to control on the right-hand side there. And this comes out of some work done by the founder of Visa, Dee Hock, who said that most traditional organisations try to develop order into control. So they're very much working on the right-hand side of that diagram, where they're trying to find out what works and manage it very tightly and develop very controlled processes. And he said what we actually need to do as organisations in fast-changing environments is we need to come back towards the intersection of chaos and order, right in the middle of that diagram, and actually work in that space where things are emerging and things don't quite make sense. That's where we can get to be more creative, that's where we can be more responsive, and that's where we can actually be ahead of the competition. And I just feel that if you want to do transformational innovation, you need to go back even further. You need to go back to that space on the very left-hand side where you've got the light and the crystal sort of sitting there making absolutely no sense, where something doesn't exist yet. And you need to be able to play in that space and see what comes out of something, which is quite, it's so new it doesn't even exist. So how do we design a process where we can think about the problem differently and challenge things, where we can pull in a network of people, all with interesting ideas, to be in an interesting space that bring different aspects together and that play in something that doesn't make sense. And so what we've developed is this process called XTK Projects. And as I said, it's peer-sourced funding for cross-disciplinary ideas that don't yet make sense. So the first thing we did was challenge the idea that innovation had to be around investment. And we said, what if it's not about investing in something? What if it's actually about paying it forward? So our model is about providing funds to interesting ideas, but the payoff is a pay it forward. So they're expected to either be successful, pay something else, fund something else, or they're expected to fail and fail spectacularly, and then share the outcomes of their failure with other people trying to do something similar. So in October, the projects that we're funding will come back and report on how they're having some success or how they are failing spectacularly. The second thing we did was go back to the network and say, how do we use the power of the network to peer fund this work? And so we asked people to contribute an amount of money which would hurt when they handed it over. So not your $5 thing, or not, you know, and not being a traditional investor of $1,000, but something that just felt like you were committed. And to be involved in funding, and also then to blur the lines between who are the investors and who are the project people. The third thing we did was we said this has to happen in a space which allows us to collaborate. So some of that has been online and pulling people online through Twitter and through blogs, but we also had a launch at Tuxedo Cabaret venue where we brought together theatre directors, digital designers, ecologists, engineers to come and talk through ideas and listen to what the process was all about. That's how we've designed it, and we've really only got two rules. So the first rule is that it has to be cross-disciplinary, and the second rule is that it mustn't make any sense. So when people are putting forward project ideas, they have to show how two ideas come together, and they have to explain what it is that they still don't know, what it is that they're still trying to find out, where the aspect of it is that it doesn't really make sense to them yet. So we launched XTK on the 9th of June. As I said, we had about 40 people come into the room to share ideas and to talk about things. To me, the excitement of that night was summarised in a couple of conversations. So first of all, we were able to put the Director of Forensic Science in touch with the Royal Institution of Australia, and that director is now doing some professional development for teachers. So we've created a nice collaboration that didn't exist before, and I think that's just marvellous. The other one was over eavesdropping really, on a conversation between my friend Rick, who is who models wind patterns using supercomputers, and the director of the Centre for Social Innovation. And I could hear them talking about prototyping, social innovation design and agile programming across two completely different spaces. And I thought that's exactly what we want to do when we bring people together to do interesting things that don't yet make sense. I guess the next steps for us are unknown. We don't know what's going to happen because we haven't imposed any rules or structure on this project, because the idea is to discover something that is so new that it hasn't been invented yet, and not to bound it by any rules. So I guess my last slide is just the XTK projects in the middle of all of that, saying, well, what happens next and how do we draw on this? And for me, the fact that we have universities, we have people from government departments who do policy on innovation, on art and on sustainability. And we have other organisations like the Cancer Council of South Australia all saying to us, we want to be involved. You know, we want to be able to provide access to infrastructure, equipment or people or whatever you need for whatever it is that you do next. Looking forward to it. So thank you very much for having me to talk about it.
Thanks, Kristin. That did actually make total sense, so thank you very much indeed. It's really great, and it's also really important to say that when a couple of your slides came up, it did say threat detected, and what we decided to do is those slides will all be available online, and we can all make those possible to see, but it was quite apposite at the time when you came up on that. Thank you very much indeed, Kristin. You can now go to bed now, because what time is it there? What's the time? What time have you got? What time have you got there? What time is it in Adelaide?
No, it's just after 9 o'clock. So
no, that's all right then. Okay, have a nice glass of wine. Thank you very much indeed, Kristin.